There's something most people will never understand. When certain forces can't label you, they try to eliminate you. Not because you're dangerous in the traditional sense, but because your very existence breaks their systems. Not because you're loud, but because your silence says too much. What you carry disrupts the narrative they've spent decades trying to control. There was once a mission launched behind curtains that don't appear on any map. It wasn't about catching criminals, it was about erasing disruptions. An order moved in silence, born not from justice but from fear. A name, a photo, and one chilling directive: disarm before detonation. A quiet panic disguised as procedure. But this wasn't the kind of target that could be boxed into a folder or tracked through old habits. What they thought was a simple case unraveled into an anomaly so uncontainable it started shifting the investigator's own sense of reality. What began as surveillance turned into spiritual confrontation. What began as protocol turned into prophecy. And as they peeled back the layers of this existence, they saw it. This wasn't a person playing the game. This was an energy rewriting the game board. Their methods failed. Their profiles blurred. Their calculations broke under the weight of something that was never meant to be measured. What they found wasn't a subject, it was a signal that others like it were waking up, too. And no file could hold that. If your heart overflows with God's blessings, let that love shine. Click the super thank you button and give $40 or more to plant seeds of faith that will impact countless lives. Your generosity reflects His abundance. Be a vessel of His grace and watch His kingdom flourish through you. There are profiles that unravel like tangled yarn, predictable, messy, and filled with the usual stains of secrecy. But this wasn't that. This wasn't a case file, it was a mirror no one wanted to look into. The deeper the details went, the more they reflected back something unclassifiable. Something that resisted containment. Normally, a job like this came with a checklist and a shadowy handshake. But this time, the message came faceless, stripped of the usual disguises of identity. There was no talk of bank statements or backdoor affairs. The demand was chilling in its precision: locate the invisible levers, extract the origin of their unbreakable will, dismantle it before it spreads. Not to expose a secret, but to stop a ripple from becoming a revolution. The agent expected to find a rebel armed with secrets, maybe someone tangled in dangerous truths. What they encountered instead was a walking contradiction, not a person armed with knowledge, but a presence shaped by evolution. This wasn't about information, it was about transformation. Something had changed in you so fundamentally that it couldn't be undone or silenced. The first sign came quickly, but it wasn't noise that caught attention, it was the absence of it. Everything about your existence radiated conscious design. Nothing careless. Nothing random. Like a system too refined to crack. Every choice traced back to intention. But the unease wasn't just in the pattern, it was in the history. The strangeness was that this sharp awareness didn't just appear recently. It echoed back into chapters where most stumble and guess. There were decisions made before the storm, boundaries drawn before betrayal, exits taken before the collapse. A pattern of movements not based on fear, but on a sense of timing only someone decades ahead would understand. Some individuals learn by repetition, by failure, by instruction. But there are rare ones who seem to learn by firelight from a future that hasn't happened yet. Their decisions whisper of something unseen, like they're reading signals most can't detect, solving equations no one else even knows exist. And that's when the fear begins to creep in, not for what they've done, but for what they must know. If you've been touched by God's goodness, don't keep it to yourself. Click super thank you and sow a gift of $40 or more to help spread His light. Your giving becomes a ripple of grace, blessing hearts and building His kingdom. Let His overflow pour through you. What looked like emotional residue at first turned out to be something far more intentional. The map of their past wasn't fragmented or accidental, it was a crafted mechanism. Events most would bury were instead archived with purpose. Every disappointment had been cataloged. Every deception decoded. It was no longer just a story of survival, it had been a training ground wearing the mask of suffering. This wasn't recovery, it was reprogramming. Somewhere along the journey, pain was stripped of its weight and reconstructed as strategy. While others collapsed under the gravity of their stories, this presence moved like someone who had reverse-engineered every fall and carved the blueprints into their spine. It didn't resemble healing, it resembled design. What others might dismiss as broken chapters had become a complex structure of encrypted solutions. The agony had been rearranged into a series of internal markers, each one activated in moments of threat or betrayal like a code unlocking pre-installed wisdom. Where others reacted, this one calculated. The difference wasn't an emotion. It was an awareness. They didn't flinch in familiar storms because they'd walked that path wearing different names and different seasons. But the internal compass had stayed the same, calibrated by a history that was studied, not avoided. Pain wasn't an enemy, it was a teacher. And that made them untouchable in ways even the sharpest minds couldn't prepare for. Each hour spent studying their patterns dismantled the algorithms the investigator had trusted their whole career. Predictions failed. Templates broke. It was as if someone had shattered the statistical frameworks of human development and rebuilt them around a logic system no textbook had ever dared describe. This wasn't behavioral deviance. It was a new species of consciousness. There are those who survive by bending toward the systems that tried to break them. And then there are the anomalies, those who, through invisible rebellions, reconstruct their identity beyond the reach of any blueprint. What the investigator encountered wasn't someone shaped by their damage, but someone who had outgrown the very framework damage was meant to define. There was nothing linear about the transformation. Records showed sequences of events that, by all logic, should have bred dependence, cracks where most would have built walls. Instead, what emerged was something untraceable by metrics, skills without predictable roots, connections that didn't follow social rhythms, and a path stitched together by a compass no institution issued. But the part that dismantled every assumption wasn't the history of rejection, it was what had been built in its shadow. There were no signs of longing, no loops of unfinished emotional business. What appeared instead was a kind of elevation. The patterns didn't speak of survival, they spoke of sovereignty reclaimed from the ash of disconnection. They found echoes of exits that looked like loss but felt like initiation. Every disappearance, every withdrawal from another life, had become raw material for internal construction. Not a fortress, but a realm. One crafted not out of bitterness but self-reliance so total, it made absence irrelevant. Where most would have sought inclusion, this blueprint didn't bother waiting for an invitation. It authored its own belonging. And the metrics of normal human behavior, cling, chase, compensate, simply didn't apply. Rejection became fertilizer, not failure. Estrangement birthed direction. What rattled the investigator most wasn't what this person did, it was how they did it. In situations built to provoke collapse, there was no emotional combustion. Just a stillness that felt ancient. Decisions weren't driven by need or fear, but by something quieter and more complex. As if every crisis had already been rehearsed somewhere beyond the conscious mind. The mission had been to locate vulnerabilities. But how do you measure fault lines in someone who no longer runs on the emotional circuitry that creates them? The patterns weren't just hard to crack, they may have been rewritten entirely. And that meant the real danger hadn't even begun to reveal itself. There are forces some never learn to name, silent responses from the fabric of existence itself. The investigator didn't stumble onto your power through surveillance or strategy. It revealed itself slowly, like a truth too vast to be seen all at once. The deeper they looked, the more reality itself began to bend around your name, not from vengeance, but from some unspoken order seeking equilibrium. The deeper they traced your history, the more disoriented they became. Connections unraveled like echoes in reverse, betrayals followed by uncanny fallout. Deals collapsed without warning. Romances crumbled under their own weight. And yet, no fingerprints were left behind. There was no campaign. No scheme. Just a strange, symmetrical erosion of everyone who had tried to fracture your spirit. They searched every angle: influence, retaliation, indirect sabotage. Nothing held. The outcomes weren't engineered, they simply happened. And always in a way that mirrored the exact nature of the harm. It was as if your life operated inside a silent algorithm that recalibrated reality every time someone tampered with your peace. There was a current you moved within, one that couldn't be fabricated. The more faithfully you lived, the more distortion was expelled. Falsehoods couldn't anchor. Manipulation couldn't stay hidden. Your presence didn't just attract what was aligned, it exposed what wasn't, and the fallout came as naturally as gravity. It became clear this wasn't a subject that could be cornered or swayed. Influence couldn't hold where presence rewrote the rules. The tools the investigator relied on, emotional leverage, social triggers, simply slid off. Every attempt to pin you down unraveled into nothing, like trying to trap light in a net. And then came the part they couldn't explain in any report. That what the client called your sensitivity was not a flaw, but the result of a long, unflinching journey into the places most people bury. You had faced the fractures within yourself without flinching, had steadied your own potential for ruin, not to destroy it, but to make peace with its voice. You didn't deny your shadows. You understood them. And by refusing to exile any part of yourself, you became someone impossible to disarm. Because no one could use what you already claimed. No one could shame what you had integrated. The investigator wasn't tracking someone who had avoided destruction, they were tracking someone who had made it speak. There are beings who survive storms, and then there are those who become the storm's map. That's what the investigator was beginning to face, not someone naive to darkness, but someone who had studied it closely enough to stop mistaking shadows for threats. The evidence was everywhere, not of innocence, but of precision. You didn't react, you anticipated. You didn't flinch, you calculated. You had built clarity in the very rooms others lose themselves in. The patterns told a story most never learned to read. In scenarios where kindness is often exploited, you chose discernment. When flattery arrived dressed as loyalty, you didn't hesitate to sever ties. And in spaces where being agreeable might earn favor, you chose to stand alone rather than bend. You had trained yourself to tolerate discomfort better than deception. That alone made you dangerous, but only to those who needed your silence to keep their illusion intact. The investigator finally understood the truth. This wasn't about how much light you carried, but how familiar you were with your shadows. Every part of your being operated without internal denial. Nothing was repressed, nothing was off limits within you. You had nothing to hide from yourself, and that made you incapable of being tamed by anyone else. The threat wasn't your strength. It was your wholeness. Where others posed a risk because of volatility or exposure, you posed a challenge because nothing could be turned against you. Every internal lever they might have pulled had already been disassembled and reassembled by your own hand. You weren't reactive. You were resolved. That was the moment the message came in. The mission parameters had shifted. New instructions bypassed all professional protocol. If no weakness could be uncovered, one was to be manufactured. Not discovered, designed. Digital trails were to be manipulated. Stories were to be planted. Circumstances engineered. The objective was no longer observation, it was erosion. The target wasn't meant to be studied. The target was meant to be silenced. The scope of the operation cracked wide open. This was no longer about legality or public safety. It had never been. This was about neutralizing a figure who broke the illusion that control was necessary for order. You represented something that defied infrastructure, a person who didn't need the system to feel whole. Not because of outer power or privilege, but because you had gone deep enough within yourself that no one else's approval could rewrite your script. The real threat wasn't what you could say. It was that your life proved what they swore was impossible, that a person could walk through hell, refuse to be corrupted, and still emerge untethered. Some presences don't speak loudly because they lack power, they remain quiet because they are the power. The investigator didn't understand that at first. But once the second set of orders arrived, darker, more aggressive, and void of justification, something internal began to fracture. And just as that fracture formed, they encountered a revelation that changed everything. Your silence was not emptiness. It was a container. And it was full. What at first appeared as detachment, as reserved emotion, began revealing itself as something radically precise. The lack of constant explanation, the minimal speech, the restraint in reactive settings, it wasn't fear. It was discipline. While others revealed themselves out of compulsion, you held your ground with the elegance of someone who knew the stakes of every word released. They began to see the truth beneath the surface. Silence wasn't your absence from the game, it was your strategy for dominating it. You moved like someone who understood the velocity of language. Like someone who had seen what careless speech could ruin and vowed to let their silence become more disarming than confrontation ever could. They sifted through moments when others had baited you, tried to chip at your resolve, hoping to provoke confession or chaos. And in each scene, they found no trace of reaction. You were still. Not passive. Not indifferent. Focused. Not because you lacked emotion, but because you trained your responses not to serve your ego, but your mission. This wasn't the coldness of repression, it was the clarity of one who had done the internal wiring. One who knew how energy moved through spaces and how words, once spoken, couldn't be retrieved. You held back not from fear but from mastery. That's when the investigator realized they weren't watching someone be silent. They were watching someone refuse to leak power. And with every attempt to breach you, their tools failed. The techniques that once extracted confessions with ease found no purchase. How do you corner someone who no longer carries guilt? How do you pressure someone whose inner compass doesn't shake? They weren't just observing resistance. They were standing before someone who had already survived the interrogation of self. But what shook them most wasn't tactical, it was personal. The more time they spent inside your story, the more they noticed their own unraveling. Your stillness echoed back their own restlessness. Your clarity made them confront how long they traded truth for stability. Their report turned into a confession to themselves of all the ways they'd never dared to live. Your example started rewiring them. Not by lecture, not by confrontation, but by contrast. You didn't need to prove anything. Your alignment revealed everything. And for the first time in years, they began to ask questions they'd buried. Who would they be without the uniform? Without the scripts? Without the fear of losing what was never real to begin with? And just like that, something irreversible happened. The assignment dissolved, but the lesson remained. The hunter had become a listener. The analyst had become a seeker. They hadn't been sent to dismantle you. They'd been sent to witness something most never touch, a human being who doesn't flinch, who doesn't bend, and who doesn't betray themselves, even when the world demands it. Some people spend their lives searching for a way forward. But there are rare individuals who don't walk toward fate, they restructure the landscape until fate walks to them. That's what the investigator stumbled upon, not someone pursuing a path, but someone who had become the kind of presence that bends timelines. What they uncovered was not a story of coincidence. It was a series of events too precisely timed to dismiss. Needs that met their solutions before urgency could settle in. Encounters with people whose relevance would only be understood months later. Blockages that dissolved without resistance. Everything moved as though the rhythm of the world had shifted to sync with a private tempo only one person could hear. No trail of manipulation emerged. No carefully built networks. No transactional strategy. The patterns didn't trace back to effort, they radiated from alignment. You had become so internally synchronized with what you were here to do that the outside world started responding as if it had no choice. Like reality itself had become collaborative rather than conditional. This was not ambition wrapped in luck. This was clarity reconfiguring cause and effect. The investigator realized they weren't dealing with someone who got lucky, they were observing someone who no longer needed luck. Every step you took filtered out what was false and magnetized what was meant. Not because you chased it, but because you became it. The shift became undeniable. The world around you adapted to your integrity. Chaos avoided you. Falsehood couldn't hold. People couldn't fake their way into your space without consequences. The investigator had studied systems their entire life, but this wasn't part of any system. This was sovereignty as a frequency. Then came the final instruction. An ultimatum dressed in urgency. Action was to be taken. Smear, discredit, dismantle. With the full weight of approval from the very machine that had sent them. But the one reading those orders had already changed. The transformation wasn't theoretical anymore, it had entered them. They stood at a threshold few ever meet, the moment where career and conscience split into separate roads. And in their hands was the evidence of how systems neutralize what they cannot own. But the target wasn't just a person. It was a possibility. A living argument against everything they had been told to believe was necessary to survive. And for the first time, the mission stopped being about you. It became about them. About whether they would let fear continue to dictate their ethics. About whether they would allow a blueprint built on compliance to erase someone who had simply refused to shrink. Some individuals become dangerous not because of what they know, but because of what they are. That's what unnerved the investigator most, not that you were hiding something critical, but that you embodied something they'd never been trained to identify, let alone confront. They hadn't been tasked with exposing information. They had been sent to unravel a mystery that walked, breathed, and made its own rules. There was no lock to pick, no vault to crack. The layers weren't physical, they were energetic. You didn't keep secrets behind barriers, you were the threshold. Access wasn't denied with force. It was never granted without alignment. What looked like guardedness was actually refinement, a life calibrated to reveal itself only to those who carried the frequency of truth. The more they watched, the more they realized your selectivity wasn't defensive, it was deliberate architecture. Not everyone could step into your space and remain unchanged. You had learned that exposure without discernment is erosion, and so you moved with the discernment of one who knows that not every hand deserves to hold sacred things. Trust wasn't your default currency. It was a reward, one that required the kind of integrity most people hadn't cultivated. You didn't shrink out of fear, you curated out of clarity. What others mistook for aloofness was actually a disciplined refusal to waste your essence on those who only showed up to extract. Every part of your orbit was calibrated with intention. Energy. Time. Emotion. Nothing moved in your world without first passing through a filter of wisdom sharpened by lived experience. The investigator came to understand that you weren't guarded, you were exact. You didn't vanish, you protected what mattered. That was the real threat. Control mechanisms don't work on people who no longer run from themselves. Manipulation relies on confusion, and you had long since made peace with every version of who you were. There was no guilt left to exploit, no chaos left to ignite. You had already survived your own judgment. And then came the most jarring realization: the more harm directed your way, the more the narrative collapsed on those who cast it. Not because you retaliated, but because you no longer carried the weight of revenge. The imbalance always corrected itself. Not through your force, but through the quiet gravity of your alignment. Falsehoods eroded on contact with your presence. Schemes folded under the pressure of your stillness. Even those who came to fracture you ended up confronting their own fractures. And the investigator knew, as their own transformation unfolded, that you weren't just defying the system, you were showing others that escape was possible. You weren't a secret keeper. You were the quiet evidence of another kind of existence, one that doesn't beg to be believed, doesn't argue to be understood, and doesn't fracture under surveillance. The true danger was never what they might find in your past. It was what others might awaken to if they saw you clearly. There are forces that adapt to pressure, and then there are those who neutralize pressure simply by existing beyond its reach. That was the unsettling realization. Every attempt to shake you only revealed how deeply rooted you already were. The closer they looked, the more evident it became: you weren't armored against destruction. You had been designed through it. Every tactic meant to fracture you fell flat, not because they were weak, but because you no longer housed the cracks they were built to exploit. Resistance only echoed back your stability. Isolation became meaningless in the presence of someone who had already learned to find everything they needed within. The mission had never stood a chance. The conclusion they were meant to write was never delivered. Instead, the investigator vanished, not into secrecy, but into sovereignty. They walked away from a legacy of loyalty to systems that demanded obedience over truth. Whether they left to protect your existence or to reclaim their own, one thing became clear: the threat was never your presence, it was your proof. You represented a variable no algorithm could factor in. You weren't dangerous because of your actions, but because your alignment made certain rules obsolete. You were the quiet collapse of structures built on obedience. You were the living interruption of dependency. You were what happens when authenticity refuses to bend. Every decision you made sent out signals, small but seismic, to those watching. Not to impress, but to interrupt. Each time you honored your core over convenience, you activated others. Each time you chose principle over performance, you cracked the illusion further. You weren't asking for change. You were the change refusing to be ignored.